A candle heel clattered to the flagstones and the threshold priest hissed, "Do not speak," as the dying man's hand convulsed. The investigator moved from the doorway and stepped into the bedside circle. Suspicion hard at his throat as he watched the priest tuck a folded scrap against the villager's lips. The priest shook his head and pressed the key pendant to the corpse's chest. Family voices rose and fell around them. In those first breaths, the problem was clear. A secret teaching that could only be given at the moment of death, and a community that relied on that rule to keep order. The investigator had come to test that rule. He kept his coat collar turned up and his hands folded until the first question formed. What lay inside that folded scrap, and why would a community surrender its speech at the threshold? He had read ledger entries, traced names on funerary stele, and seen brassy reliquaries sold at market. Those facts guided him, but suspicion pushed him to witness the rite in person. He kept his voice low. The investigator's tone was even, his pauses measured, his intent to record rather than to inflame who is watching. The widow demanded, stepping forward with a hand that did not stop trembling, "What is this for?" The priest's jaw flexed. "You hold your peace, Mara. This is not for gossip." The widow's nails scraped the hem of the burial shroud. The investigator noticed the sound and filed it. He catalogued details. A brass pince nez tucked into a pocket, the worn leather grimoire at the investigator's hip, the sigil embroidered on the priest's chest band. Concrete objects told a concrete story. The ritual was administered, guarded, and policed. The priest bent lower and began the whisper song, a line of syllables so low the widow could not catch a single word. The investigator stepped closer and watched the priest's thumb trace a series of shallow cuts on the edge of the key pendant. He recorded the motion with his eyes and then with a tiny lead point on a scrap of paper. Acolytes held candles in a ring. Their faces were pale with exhaustion. When the priest's voice lifted to a distinct cadence, the dying man's breath thinned, and the widow pressed both hands to her mouth. A change moved through the circle. The investigator felt fear as the syllables slid into the air, and the eldest acolyte's jaw clenched. That shift tightened the scene. The investigator's actions followed. He reached for the edge of the grimoire and let his fingers rest on its cover, a deliberate, visible act to show he was present and noting. The priest did not meet his eyes. The investigator's suspicion hardened into doubt. Did the community accept silence out of faith, fear, or both? After the breath stopped, the priest slipped the folded scrap from the villager's mouth and folded it into the reliquary. "It is sealed," the priest, and his voice carried a finality the widow could not swallow. The investigator watched the widow's shoulders collapse into a stuttering sob and saw the priest's mouth harden into ritual detachment. He stepped back. Another beat later he approached the scribe's scriptorium, where his investigation would meet resistance. The scriptorium smelled of iron gall and dust. Wooden shelves leaned under the weight of stitched parchments. A scribe named Roland barred the investigator's entrance with a ledger held like a shield. "No access. Roland. Orders from the chapter." The investigator placed a hand on the shelf and looked at a torn edge of an exposed folio, and Roland's gaze slid away when the investigator named the specific codex. "You always press for codices about final rites, Roland," his voice brittle. "You know our rules." The investigator did not argue. He listened, then let his fingers rake the air as if steadying himself, while his other hand moved toward a loose scrap on the floor. Skepticism shifted into purpose. The investigator knelt, swept the torn fragment into his palm, and folded it into his coat without a thought for polite process. He kept his heartbeat small and focused on the text-synced line, an oath-binding clause. He read 2 words aloud under his breath, concrete and crude. "Speak after death." That fragment altered his hypothesis. Perhaps the rite did not only pass knowledge, but also bound the living. A small, private reveal turned into a new problem. How many households accepted that compact, and what happened when that compact failed? He confronted Roland in the courtyard. "Roland, why deny me the records?" The scribe's hands rose. "We keep things safe. That is all. Safe for whom?" "The investigator, for the order that depends on silence." "Roland." The investigator's tone sharpened. "Roland, you left this fragment on the floor. Who moves these texts?" Roland looked away. The investigator saw a flash of shame pass over the scribe's face, and then a stubborn refusal. The scribe's choices, not the investigator's speculation, forced the next step, a demonstration. Night found the investigator at the mortuary's rehearsal chamber. The threshold priest called no witnesses, but let the investigator in on a condition. Watch and do not interfere. The priest sat and arranged a small table. An acolyte brought out an ornate key pendant on a red cord and placed it between them. The priest moved like a man who had performed the gesture 1,000 times. He lifted the pendant and showed the investigator the worn notch at its base, only at the threshold, the priest not before. Not for outsiders, the investigator noted that the priest's shoulders tightened when he said the last word. The priest's explanation was concrete. The pendant marked a social rule, a pause that held gossip at bay and kept authority intact. "We tell them the final secret only once. When the threshold opens, the priest," his voice low and tinged, "the household then accepts the loss and the keeper binds the oath." The investigator watched the acolyte mirror each gesture, saw the chord's knot and the way the acolyte's eyes dropped when the priest emphasized the rule. Skepticism shifted again, this time into a precise plan. If the rule bound households, the investigator decided to follow the material traces. Before dawn he walked with the gravedigger, Thomas, toward an overgrown mound. The ground was soft with root and moss. Thomas stabbed his spade and worked at a shallow pit, his breath visible in the cold air. They found skeletons stacked in a single grave, each collarbone still bearing a rusted clasp where a pendant had once hung. Thomas brushed dirt away from a breastbone and revealed a tiny loop of metal. They were all given the same key. Thomas, not everyone sees what it opens. The investigator counted the loops and felt an H of clarity. The right's reach was systematic. As light rose, the investigator traced the pendant designs with a gloved fingertip. He found the same notch he had seen in the rehearsal chamber. The community had accepted a visible token of secrecy. More entire households had been enrolled. He tucked his findings into his notebook and felt a surge of purpose that pushed aside his earlier doubt. That surge carried him toward public confrontation, because records and graves compelled accountability. At the mound's edge, the threshold priest found him. The priest's voice did not shout. It used authority instead. "You should not have been here." The priest, "Those graves are ours to guard. They are graves," the investigator replied. "These people belong to families, not rituals." The priest's hand went to the key pendant at his throat. Acolyte Marin stood behind him and folded her arms. "Marin, stand down," the priest softly. The investigator stepped closer. "Priest who decides when the final secret is withheld." The priest's jaw set. "The chapter decides. The village consents." "That is how order holds." The acolyte's eyes flicked to the investigator and then to the ground. The conversation tightened into argument. The investigator pressed. "Which households? Which documents back that decision?" The priest barked one sharp answer. Enough. There followed 3 rapid exchanges as the acolyte Marin tried to mediate, and the gravedigger Thomas refused to cede the mound's disturbance. "Thomas, you dug at my command." The priest, "No." Thomas replied, "I dug because they asked me to dig the back," and forth left no resolution. But it forced the priest into a position where private ritual authority met public exposure. The widow Mara arrived in the courtyard, and her presence changed the balance. She held a small empty reliquary in her palm and set it on a stone bench. "He promised me the words," Mara directly to the priest. "I was told he would hear the final thing before he died. I received nothing but silence and this empty box." The priest's gaze flicked to the reliquary and then away. The investigator watched Mara place her fingers flat on the lid and then pull them back as if expecting to feel a word. Mara's admission made the priest hesitate. His control of the social narrative loosened. Emotion shifted in Mara's face. Betrayal flared and then a fragile calm as she chose to speak publicly. Her disclosure made others glance at their own mouths and hands. The investigator used that beating pause and asked Mara to tell him exactly what she had been promised. Mara named a phrase and a promise, uttered in the dying man's hearing. "You would be given the final knowledge that would guide your widow's acts," she said. He promised it with his hand on the reliquary. The priest's silence answered more than any retort. The investigator felt resolve harden into anger. He decided to force a direct test of the rule. The midfielder Minnie Cliffhanger arrived when an acolyte, younger and anxious, tried a premature invocation. He worked at the grave edge while the priest argued with the investigator. He cupped his hands over the open pit and chanted a line the priest had used at the bedside. A column of smoke erupted between the acolyte's fingers, cold and blue, and the air filled with the smell of scorched linen. The acolyte shrieked. The investigator grabbed at the boy to pull him back, and in the same movement the priest moved to seize the key pendant. The acolyte's act had torn the rule, and the result was immediate. A physical reaction to a ritual attempted out of sequence. That misfire altered the scene into chaos. The grave's edge thrummed with noise, the acolyte's face drained. His chanting had broken into raw, thin sounds. The priest swore and lunged. The investigator twisted to keep the acolyte from falling into the pit. They grappled. Tumas tried to steady a lantern and nearly dropped it. Mara shouted, "Stop," and the sound cut across the MLE. The investigator pulled free a small metal tag from the acolyte's cord as he was flung aside. It bore the same notch. The physical clash put authority against exposure and forced a decision. 3 quick lines of argument broke out. Enough. The priest, gripping the acolyte's shoulder, "You do not know the words. You keep the words to keep power." The investigator, "We need proof," Tumas replied. The back and forth lasted moments, and then the priest forced calm with a slow chant, his hollow timbre filling the space like an instrument. The acolyte's breath came in shallow pulls. The investigator pressed his palms to the dirt to steady himself and to examine the scorched edges of the earth where the smoke had struck. After the incident, the community recoiled and demanded answers. The investigator took the torn manuscript fragment from his coat and laid it on the mortar table in the mortuary antechamber. The priest watched without speaking. The investigator opened the fragment and read aloud a clause about an oath binding the household to silence until the threshold opened. He read the words plainly and then watched the priest's mouth tighten. The investigator set the fragment beside a single key pendant he had taken from the acolyte and said, "This is not just superstition. It is a social instrument." The priest responded with a ritual justification. "These rites hold families together. When names leave them," he said, "they give order to grief." The investigator listened and then asked, "Who enforces order when the order itself is dishonest?" The priest turned away. Mara touched the pendant and wept once, a sound that did not hide the way she had been missiled. Thomas traced a dirt circle with his boot and asked bluntly, "How many of us signed this away?" The investigator catalogued the consequences and decided disclosure was necessary. He recorded testimony from Roland the scribe, who admitted he had been ordered to withhold certain folios after a chapter decision the previous year. They me to seal the pages that named the clause. "Roland, I sealed them because my hands shook when I thought of the families." Roland's voice broke on the last sentence. The investigator wrote it down, not in moral judgment, but as evidence. Marin, the acolyte, hovered and then chose to act. She placed a palm over the reliquary and said, "I helped where I was told." I did not know the oath bound like chains. Her confession moved the priest to a rare public H. He touched his carved staff as if recall pained him. The investigator saw the priest's posture shift from command to defense. That shift provided the final tension that would determine who controlled the narrative. The chapter's climax played out not in words, but in an embodied choice. The priest moved to secure the reliquary. The investigator stepped in and took 2 actions. He unfastened the reliquary and showed its inner lining to the assembly, and he held up the torn manuscript. "This belonged to him," he said, naming the dead villager aloud. He did not receive what was promised. He received an empty box and a secret kept from his people. Mara gasped and then spoke, short and fierce. "Priest, give me the phrase you promised." The priest's lips pressed shut. In that silence the community made a decision. The priest reached into his robes and, for the first time that day, allowed his voice to tremble in front of them. He recited a formula that was not the promised final secret, but a litany of obligations and safeguards meant to prevent social breakdown. The words did not answer Mara's demand. Tuma shook his head. The investigator closed his notebook and felt a cold clarity settle. The ritual had always been a mechanism of control more than a passage to knowledge. In the aftermath, the investigator took 2 objects, the torn fragment and a single ornate key pendant. He placed both into a small leather satchel and zipped it closed. The priest stepped back, his hands empty but his authority bruised. The community did not feel whole, they felt exposed. The investigator's suspicion had moved through doubt into action, then into fear during the misfire, and finally into a steadied resolve to reveal how the rite functioned. Thomas returned to his shovel and began to level the disturbed patches of earth. Mara walked away with the reliquary in her arms, its emptiness now a visible claim in the market square. Roland went back to his ledgers, slower, his face grey. The priest gathered the acolytes and retreated into the mortuary corridor, the carved staff tapping a slow tempo on the stone. The investigator stayed long enough to lock the mortuary antechamber door behind him. Then he turned and left a note under the door latch for any who would ask. He had secured evidence and would publish the mechanics of the rite. He did not write a manifesto in that moment. He closed the satchel, felt the weight of metal and paper, and made a concrete choice. He would show the wound in their social contract, not merely name it. The house calls and testimonies would follow. The chapter ends with the investigator securing the torn fragment and the key pendant in his satchel, closing the mortuary door, and stepping away, resolved to place facts beside the villagers' demand for truth. The investigator lunged forward and caught the threshold priest's sleeve as the priest tucked a small, wrapped object into his robe. Suspicion tightened his fingers around fabric and drove the movement. He did not allow himself hesitation. The priest jerked back, the object slipping half, hidden beneath a fold. "Do not." The threshold priest, low and hoarse, and his hand went to the pendant at his throat. An acolyte in the doorway froze with a scrap of parchment between her fingers. The room smelled of vinegar, old linen, and the smoke the priest kept burning at his feet. Within 5 sentences the central problem was visible. An object intended for secrecy had been taken from the mortuary ledger and concealed on the priest's person, and the investigator would either recover it or lose the only lead on a rite whispered only at the edge of life. He stepped harder into the chamber, palms ready to wrench the cloth free. The mortuary's stone lane thrummed underfoot. The air inside the antechamber was colder than the night outside. Fingers left damp prints on the table where embalming tools lay. The investigator's watch hand hovered near the worn leather grimoire at his belt, a habitual, private motion that steadied his voice. "What have you done, priest?" The investigator spoke without flourish. He tugged once at the sleeve. "What did you take?" His voice was measured, not theatrical. The syllables were tools. The priest answered with the same old line he had used at the bedside months before, when the candle heel clattered to the flagstones and he hissed, "Do not speak." The investigator still remembered that hiss and the scrap the priest had tucked against a dying man's lips. That memory sat as a datum now, concrete. The priest had already hidden a folded scrap at the bedside. The investigator needed the wrapped object to confirm the pattern. The threshold priest's jaw worked. "You will not touch me," he said. He stepped backward, one hand on the carved staff at his hip. "This belongs to the right. This belongs to the dead before we speak of it." He kept his feet planted so no one could see how his fingers trembled. The investigator watched the trimmer in the priest's left hand, the most honest thing in the room. Spirals of anger rose like a physical heat behind the investigator's sternum, and he pressed his thumb against the seam of the sleeve where the object lay. Acolyte Lissa's shadow shifted in the doorway. She kept her head down, but the scrap of parchment stuck out of her fist like a white cliff. "Lisa, the investigator, give me that scrap." She blinked. "Not here," she whispered. She let the sentence trail. Lissa's lips were dry. She chewed them with an absent motion that had nothing to do with the priest's authority. The investigator's suspicion turned to impatience. He stepped to the table and knocked a small pot of powdered charcoal. The lid clattered and rolled. The sound made the priest flinch. The priest answered the flinch with accusation. "You come here dragging desecration." He lifted his chin as if the village walls could back him up. "If you pull at the threads you will harm those we swore to protect." The investigator stripped the priest's hand away from the robe with a quick, clean motion and exposed the wrapped object, a cloth the color of old bone, bound with a cord and sealed with wax stamped with a sigil the investigator had only seen once before in the ledger photographed on the village scribe's last commission. The sight of the seal shifted the investigator's mood from impatience to a precise, pinched fury. He set his jaw and asked, "What is this?" The priest breathed out. "A guard," he said. "A key." Lissa stepped forward then, so quickly that the leather on her sandals hissed against the stone. "It is not a key. It's binding," she said. Her voice betrayed how much she had rehearsed the word binding. She repeated, tracing the air with one finger. "When the dying cannot remember what to carry, it helps them hold on to one piece of truth." "Who you that?" The investigator, he watched Lissa's eyes. The acolyte's pupils had widened. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "The scribe found a torn page among grave goods," she said. "He gave it to me because he feared it would burn." The village scribe arrived unannounced 5 minutes later, hair chalked with dust, a wrapped bundle under his arm. He dropped it on the table like a confession and did not meet the priest's gaze. The page was in a clay jar with a child's bone. The scribe said, "I thought you should see it, threshold priest, before anyone else does." His voice was small but steady. He stepped close enough for the investigator to read the seam of his knuckles. He had the look of a man who had spent hours hunched over ink and could not stop finding the same letters in his sleep. An external event. Someone knocked at the mortuary door. The sound brought a split-second silence. Then the village midwife Anara pushed in, her hands raw and her apron flecked with soot. "Elder says the council comes at dawn," she said. Her eyes flicked to the investigator. "He wants you there. He says there is talk." Her words made the room tilt toward a larger danger. The investigator looked at the priest, whose face had cooled into a mask of duty. The priest placed the wrapped object on the table and wrapped both hands around it like prayer. The investigator picked up the torn page the scribe set down. The page was ragged along one edge. The ink blid where something had soaked into the fibers long ago. There were instructions in a small, cramped hand and a diagram of an object shaped like a key in a small satchel. One line had been penciled in a different hand. Give only at the last word. The investigator's eyes moved, and then set to working. He felt a new emotion to the fore. Doubt curled not in his chest as feeling but as a change of priorities. Doubt made him slower in decisions. He wanted corroboration before he risked the village's peace. "You hid a page at the bedside in the last case." The investigator, placing the torn sheet down between the priest and the scribe, hid like a charge. The priest's hand found his pendant and did not let go. "You knew what it meant." The priest's voice was dry. I knew how the man feared. I kept it for him. I kept what he asked. He looked at the investigator with a blend of shame and purpose. You would tear the right into the square of public knowledge and leave those who need secrecy exposed. The investigator's jaw tightened. You hid a scrap at the bedside and you told no one. You asked not to speak. That is why I am here. He paused long enough to let the word here settle on the mortuary stone. Do you deny it? He, the priest. The village scribe's knuckles whitened. Lissa watched the priest and the investigator like someone watching two knives, not sure which would be used. The threshold priest breathed, then bowed his head. I do not deny it. He kept his eyes down when he spoke the next words. The right is older than your law. Investigator. It binds memory to a single token so the dead travel with what matters. We keep it because people fear what they would forget. The investigator felt the emotion shift again, suspicion flattening into anger, then slipping into a prickly, skeptical curiosity. He pressed, "Show me the ledger. Show me the oldest entries." The priest's fingers closed like a trap. "Not yet," he said, "not before the council." That reply brought the village elder crashing into the mortuary like a cold wind. He arrived with midwife Anara at his shoulder and 2 townspeople behind him. The elder's cloak was patched and still smelled faintly of fields. He did not remove his hat. He pointed at the investigator. "You tread where you should not," he said. "You lay hands on our keeper. Who gave you right?" His voice pulled other villagers' attention to the doorway. Voices rose like a tide. The investigator braced and let the council's accusation land. This confrontation would become public. The stakes expanded beyond the mortuary. Words emerged fast, then a rapid exchange. "He stole it, the elder. He defiles our rights." The investigator shot back. "You hide the village's last words and call it mercy." The priest interrupted. "We guard the passage, Lisa. I saw the torn page. I saw what it asked for," the scribe added. "There is a line about memory, binding, and a key. Lines piled up." The argument became a braid of claims and defenses. The village broke into 2 moving parts, those who matched the priest's measured tone and those who echoed the investigator's blunt questions. The elder's face reddened. He struck his palm against a pillar. "Enough." His voice rose to be heard over the small room. "We will take this to the Dawn Council. Until then, the mortuary remains closed to all but the threshold priest." The investigator felt the moment as a physical shift, air leaving his lungs. The council had given the priest time. Time was a resource the investigator did not possess. He could not pull the village into ruin by force. He had to collect proof outside. Night deepened. The investigator and acolyte Lissa kept watch at the grave edge. Hours later, 2 figures hunched against the rim of the burial ground. The moon sat wan, and the grass whispered against their knees. They had moved silently to a place where the threshold stones jutted out like teeth. They had found a spot within sight of the mortuary where the priest could not see them at once. Their presence was a deliberate test. They saw the threshold priest move beneath a low sky, robes dragging like a shadow. He carried the wrapped object, and an ornate key hung at his belt, catching the moon briefly like a wink. He paused beside a grave, lowered the cloth onto a slab, and then performed a sequence the investigator recognized from the torn page. He traced the sigil in ash, held the key over the cloth, and spoke a string of low syllables the night swallowed. The investigator's hands went numb with a controlled, professional shock. He had expected a ceremonial farewell. He had not expected to see the priest press the key into the binding and watch the cloth respond. The wax softened, the cord loosened, and the wrapped object unrolled to show not a relic, but a small clay token stamped with the same sigil. The investigator and Lissa watched as the priest leaned toward the corpse lying in the grave. He placed the token on the dead man's chest and tapped 3 times. The dead man's jaw twitched. The investigation's second major shift arrived. From doubt into a terrified clarity, he understood that the rite did not simply guide. It altered what the dying could carry away. It anchored a single chosen thing, and the chosen thing could be controlled by whoever held the token. The implications spread like fleas in fabric: who chose and why. The investigator's throat tightened. His hand went to his grimoire as if to keep his balance. Lissa squeezed his sleeve. "We should tell the council," she whispered. Her words were quick and brittle. "We should not keep this to ourselves." Her hands shook. The investigator looked at her. The choice crystallized into a decision that was not his alone. He thought of the elder's earlier injunction to wait. He thought of the man at the bedside months earlier whose last breath had been closed by a priest-sealed scrap. The investigator steadied himself. They returned before dawn and found the village assembled at the threshold stones, more crowded than the mortuary had been. The priest stood at the center with the ornate key pendant visible at his throat. The elder and midwife Anara faced him like two pillars of authority. The investigator stepped forward, the torn page in one hand and the clay token wrapped in a scrap of linen in the other. He held them up so the crowd could see. "You keep a key for memory," he said. "You bind what the dying may carry." His voice cut through the morning air. "You the man at his bedside not to speak," and put a folded scrap against his lips. "You no one, you made a choice that affected his passage." Why? The investigator kept the sentence tight and bare. His hands did not tremble. The priest did not flinch. The threshold priest looked at the investigator for the first time fully without the fallback of ritual hedges. "We choose for them when they cannot choose," he said. "We spare them grief. We spare their kin. We keep order. We let one truth ride with them into the dark so that families may not be left with 100 unruly recollections." His words had the slow cadence of someone reciting an ordinance. The crowd pushed and shifted. Voices rose into an argument that became sharp and quick. "You promised secrecy, midwife Anara. You promised care, the elder." The investigator answered with a question that had teeth. Who chose what truth? Who wielded that token? The priest drew the key from his chest and lifted it for the villagers to see. "If this right is to hold our dead to what matters, then not all may have it. The village must keep it whole." He straightened his back like a man offering a stark bargain. "You would keep the choice for yourself." Lisa's voice cut across the crowd. She stepped forward. "Lisa," the investigator softly, but she did not stop. She looked directly at the priest. "You do not get to decide for us." Her words pulled a different reaction from the villagers. Some faces turned to anger. Others stared as if struck by the priest's calm. The council erupted into a rapid back and forth. The elder demanded silence. The investigator made 3 crisp points. "Show the ledger, explain the rubric for choosing, and allow a witness for each right." The priest refused 2 of those outright. "We can keep the ledger sealed to preserve sanctity," he said. "We can never allow witnesses at the last word. It breaks the binding." The exchanges accelerated into a short, sharp series of lines. "You break our trust." "You preserve the dead." Who appointed you to hold the key?" "We did, our fathers, our oaths." The argument contained 6 quick, overlapping lines before the elder banged his staff and forced silence. The priest offered an ultimatum instead of a concession. "Either we maintain secrecy, and I continue to bind what must be bound, or you expose the right and release the tokens to ruin, and then you will learn what happens when families carry too many truths at once." The investigator felt the impact like cold water thrown in his face. He had anticipated moral choices, but not a public threat couched as a bargain. The village stood on a knife edge. A decision by the village elder followed, a fragile compromise. The right would remain protected in name. The ledger would be shown to a small committee, including the scribe, the midwife, and the investigator, and the priest would continue to perform the last word binding but with one named witness present at each ritual. The crowd split slowly. Some called it victory for order, others a concession to secrecy. The investigator agreed to the compromise but kept the torn page in his sleeve. He felt the emotion shift finally toward a collected resolve. working with the rules to pry them open later. After the crowd dispersed, the investigator found a narrow lane outside the mortuary and stopped. He pulled the torn fragment from his coat with a gesture that was both furtive and deliberate, and tucked it deeper into his grimoire. The page was smaller now, but the meaning it carried had grown. He had forced the priest into a public answer and won a witness for the right. But the exchange at the grave edge remained wrong in a way words could not fix. The binding altered what the dying could carry. That fact turned the village's acts into decisions that should not have been concentrated in a single hand. Lissa came up behind him and did not speak for a long time. When she finally did, it was with a voice steadier than at the mortuary. "You kept the scrap from the first bedside," she said. "Why did you not take it then?" The investigator closed the grimoire and looked at her. "I misjudged the weight of secrecy then," he said. He did not use abstract phrases. He described the motion. How he had placed the scrap back in his pocket and told himself he would return with witnesses. "That had been a mistake. We will not make that mistake again," he added. Lisa nodded. "Then do not go back empty-handed. When the priest binds again, be the one who holds the witness rope." She the last word with a brittle humor that barely covered fear. The investigator put his hand on the grimoire and felt the ribs of the binding. He had a private burden now. The torn page and the clay token's implication. He slid the fragment between two thicker folios and closed the book like one might close a wound. The chapter closed on a concrete act. The investigator pocketed a covered fragment that morning, a thin strip of the torn manuscript folded into his vest. He left the village square with the knowledge that the right remained in place, nominally protected by a compromise, and privately resolved to probe more deeply. His final movement was not a speech or a vow, it was a simple physical choice. He removed his pince-nez from his coat, tucked it into the grimoire, and walked away beneath a sky freckled with clouds. The torn page against his heart, and the clay token's image burned into his memory. He did not yet know how he would break the priest's hold, only that the piece he carried might answer the next question. The threshold priest lifted the small ornate key, and the investigator moved to seize it. Suspicion drove him forward, suspicion rooted in the scrap tucked against a villager's lips weeks before and the sleeve he had grabbed in the mortuary. The stake was plain. If the priest completed this last action, the right's secret would remain sealed. If the investigator revealed it, the village's order and the priest's authority would crack. The key hung over pale cloth and dust, and someone whispered, "Do not," as a hand went to the corpse's chest. The investigator did not wait for permission. He stepped onto sod that slumped beneath his weight and reached, fingers closing around cold metal as the priest's chant broke into a sharp sound. "Stop," the investigator, naming the act. He tugged the key free. An acolyte moved like a shadow and knocked him aside. The first confrontation had happened inside the doorway weeks earlier, when a candle heel had clattered to the flagstones. Now the same ritual reached beyond walls into open air. The problem stood visible. Who held the right to bind the dying, and what did that key unlock for those who paid the price? The investigator's face was pale and narrow under the moon. He had the habit of folding his hands when calculating, but now his fingers tightened around the key. He thought of the scrap the priest had pressed against a villager's lips in the bedside circle and the way the priest had tucked a wrapped object into his robe in the mortuary. Those concrete moments pushed him. Suspicion became action. He stepped back, holding the key where everyone could see it, and let his voice carry over the grave's edge. "Threshold priest," he said, naming the man so the whole clearing would hear. "What does that key open?" The priest's posture did not change. He stood with his staff, mask carved top catching a sliver of moonlight. Two figures detached themselves from the trees, silent acolyte John and silent acolyte Mira. Then the gravedigger Havel came forward with a shovel clutched to his chest. Someone struck a torch and the light carved the priest's robes into blocks of charcoal and rust gold. "You should not have come, investigator," the priest said. The word came hollow and low. The chant tinged timbre the investigator had heard in the hallways when the priest gave rites. "This place is bound by charter. You saw only half that which you accuse." His fingers went to the reliquary at his belt, a wrapped parcel the size of a fist. John stepped near and said, "Elder will prove it." John's voice was flat, like a man holding his breath. Mira stood mute, braid swinging against a charcoal robe. Havel spat into his palm and wiped it on his pants. His jaw worked as if measuring whether he would pick a fight or a tool. The village felt close enough to touch, figures pressed in a ring, faces lit from below by torchlight. The investigator knew names now as pressure: Threshold Priest, John, Mira, Havel, Elder Oren. Each name represented a set of loyalties. An argument broke into action. The investigator stepped toward the priest, and the priest stepped back, protecting the reliquary and the key. Acolyte John moved to block the investigator's reach. "Don't, John," the priest said. "Let him speak." The priest's voice had authority that was not entirely religious. It was also administrative. "Elder Oren will tell you. We keep the promise so the winter wards hold. We all gain a measure of protection. You would tear that away for curiosity." Curiosity. The investigator's reply was short. "You whisper secrets to the dying in exchange for obedience. I watched you tuck a scrap to a man's lips. I watched you hide a wrapped thing in the mortuary. Those are facts." His jaw worked. He the concrete observations, because abstract language would dissolve under the villagers' eyes. You bind people to a ritual for something they cannot refuse. That is not protection. It is leverage. Elder Oren stepped forward then, pushing past two villagers. He moved with the slow authority of someone who had carried a faded charter for decades. "Do not undo this," he said. "You break more than you mend. The charter binds us. If you expose the right, we lose harvest rights, we lose the river grant, we lose the gravedigger's pay. What then? What of the children?" His hands held a brittle parchment folded into a leather case. The seal had been softened by use. The investigator did not lower his gaze. "Show the charter," he asked. "Let me read it aloud." Oren opened the case with hands that shook only slightly and spread the parchment under torchlight. The script was cramped and old. There were names at the bottom, binders long dead. The clause that mattered sat in a narrow column. It spoke of a ritual kept by the village in return for obligations from a distant steward. The investigator read the line aloud. "Obedience granted in exchange for counsel at death." That was the concrete term. Counsel, not magic, but counsel in the unit of last sight. Mira muttered, "They dug a bargain we could not refuse." Her voice carried the tiredness of someone who had served at bedsides and seen men die thin and scared. Havel spiked his hand into the soil and said, "We keep the peace." "You would have men steal graves," the villagers murmured, and the mood shifted. The investigator felt a second current move through the ring. Doubt. He had expected anger or support. He had not expected the charter's practical language to sway some who had depended on it. John stepped forward and produced the carved funerary stele, wrapping its base in cloth he opened with careful fingers. The stele had the city's mark, an engraved symbol binding the village to a rent and a right. "John, this is our proof. The steward gave it when he took the river claim. We are bound." His voice hardened. The investigator watched the villagers' shoulders pull in. They had felt the charter's weight for years. Action came in the form of a scuffle. The investigator reached for the reliquary at the priest's belt. The priest clutched the parcel and spun. Then a tussle broke out at the grave's rim. Havel shoved the investigator. John struck at his arm, and the priest fell to his knees in a roll that exposed the reliquary and a pale strip of paper partially unwrapped. The paper slid into the muddy lip of the grave, and the investigator lunged to snatch it free. He did. The scrap came away brittle and flaking. On it was an inked sigil and a line of script he had seen before. an instruction that bound the right to obedience and offered a phrase to be spoken only at the threshold. The scrap smelled faintly of oil and frankincense. The investigator lifted it so the torchlight would read the letters. "It demands obedience in return for knowledge," he said, showing the words. "It says the dying receive a word that will alter how they die, and the village must keep silence." The priest sprang forward and grabbed the investigator's sleeve. "You do not understand the prayer," he said. "You will make the wrong reading." His hands were steady, but his face showed a crack. The acolytes moved in. There followed a rapid exchange of lines between the investigator and the priest, 3, then 5 quick back and forths, each short and sharp and naming the other's actions. Threshold priest, the investigator. "What does the word do?" "It eases passage," the priest answered. "Does it demand payment?" "It asks for obedience for the village's peace." "Who set that price?" "Our founders." The priest's jaw tightened. The steward. An external event interrupted. A sound from the lane, 2 villagers running toward the clearing, breath loud, one carrying a child's cap. They stopped at the edge and the child's cap winked by the torchlight. The arrival altered the dynamic. Fear about exposure extended beyond the circle. The investigator looked at the child cap and thought of the practical stakes the elder had raised. The pile of witnesses grew. The priest did something the investigator had not expected. He opened the reliquary more fully and placed the wrapped object on a flat stone. The small tooth, like charm inside, was carved from bone with lines scored across it. Beside it lay a folded scrap with a single phrase. The priest said, "Listen. Let the man read the phrase into the grave. Then let the elder recall the charter. If you still wish to break the ritual after that, do it." He set the challenge like a measured tool. The investigator would not be cajoled. He leaned over the reliquary, eyes tracing the bone charm score, and then seized the scrap. He read what it said. A line that promised that the dying a certain release if they answered a direct question at the threshold. The investigator felt a shift, anger flaring into a colder, clearer purpose. He had suspected manipulation. Now he saw the mechanism. The phrase offered consolation, but required a binding oath from the living. He raised his head. "Then read it here, threshold priest. Read it in front of the people." The words were not meant to be rhetorical. They were a demand that exposed the right to the village hearing. The priest looked at the elder, and the elder's hand went to the charter. For a moment, the clearing fell into a silence that matched the grave's mouth. Elder Oren cleared his throat and said, "The steward's men signed this on the morning of the frost wind. We traded silence for river rights. We did not know, no one then could ask differently." He looked at the priest, and then at the investigator. "If this phrase binds a life, we have used it like a lever to keep the village above the rent. Men who could not hold land were given counsel. We kept the peace so children would eat. That was the bargain. Then let the villagers choose." The investigator. "Let those who will accept the phrase at death know what it costs in obedience." He held up the scrap so others could see the letters. A village woman, Mela, stepped forward and spat on the earth. "We all know what you want," she said to the investigator. "You want to throw our covenant away. You will make us beg the steward again." Her words were blunt, and she named him directly. The argument shifted outward to the community, and the investigator recognized the second emotion shift. From suspicion to doubt among the villagers, then to clarity in his own intentions. Something unexpected happened then. Mira, the silent acolyte, moved. She had stood back until now, braids swinging. But she slid a palm down the priest's robe and revealed a narrow inner pocket. From it she drew a second scrap, folded smaller, with heavy smudges of ink. Mira spoke with a voice that had not been heard earlier. "I have been at bedsides longer than any of you. I heard what the phrase did when it was spoken at a man's last breath. He did not find rest. He found a conviction that tied him to tasks he would not remember before dawn. I kept my mouth because I feared losing my house. But I cannot watch another child pay for that. Her words landed like a stone. The priest's face tightened. Mira, he said, you break oath. We swore. You swore to the steward, she said. And the line snapped. I swore to the dead first. The revelation shifted the crowd. People took 3 steps back from the priest. John's jaw worked. Havel spat again but did not step forward. The village's trust fractured into shards of argument and fear. The investigator used the rupture. He laid the scraps on the flat stone and declared, "Then we will read both and decide openly. Charter and phrase both will be read, it in short lines so listeners would not lose the sequence. Read, decide, choose." Someone else intervened. The gravedigger Havel, who had dug more graves than any man there, said, "If you spread this, then some will go sleepless. But if you hide it, others will die tied to commands. Who will you protect, investigator?" The investigator did not answer with theory. He answered by action. He unwrapped the reliquary fully, exposing the bone charm and a third document, this one written in a different hand. The hand was neat, and the content was administrative. Instructions for the steward's agent on how to exchange municipal favors for silence. It named places where favors had been made. A bridge, a market stall, an exemption for a miller. The crowd leaned in. Elder Oren's fingers tightened on the charter. The priest's lips compressed. The investigator read the list aloud and tied names to goods. That list made the bargain concrete. It was not an abstract protection but a ledger of trade-offs. The villagers heard not doctrine but currency. At that point the priest made a choice. He stepped forward and struck the flat stone with his staff. "Enough," he said. "We are bound by more than paper. You want to break what keeps the village from the steward's taxes. You will take hunger for your revelations." His voice carried a plea that mixed duty and fear. A rapid volley of dialogue followed as the group argued under the pale sky. The investigator and the priest traded 3 to 5 short lines, each line naming the other's aim. The villagers interjected. Mala demanded, "Who will feed us?" John demanded, "Who will keep the graves?" Havel demanded, "Who will bury our sons?" The argument became practical and merciless. Then a wholly unexpected twist occurred. A young man who had been silent until then, Kalen, the steward's courier by background who had returned to marry Mala's daughter, stepped into the torchlight. Kalen had been trusted by the steward and carried letters once. "I delivered those sealed orders 10 years ago. I saw their wording. The steward did not mean only obedience for counsel. He meant leverage. He expected returns. I have a copy." Callan pulled from his coat a folded envelope with wax dull and stamped. He pushed it toward the investigator and said plainly, "Read it. This reveal changed how everyone understood the steward. Not a benefactor, but a negotiator who designed systems of power." The investigator took the envelope, slit the wax, and read a directive that specified how a village would be kept compliant. Secret counsel at death, a promise of a phrase to the dying, and a ledger of favor returns to be catalogued by the steward's men. The steward's language was dry. The document treated lives like accounts. The crowd heard the ledger and then heard the words the elderly had used to justify the bargain. The shift in understanding was sharp. What had seemed a communal protection now read as engineered dependency. A smaller, sharper conflict followed. The priest reached for Kalen. Kalen stepped back and said, "Do not touch me." The priest's fingers trembled and he did not grab. Instead he did something sudden. He spoke the phrase, aloud and clear, directly into the grave. His voice slid from chant to speech, and the sound filled the clearing. The investigator felt his scalp prickle as the syllables landed on the corpse's lips. The priest closed his eyes while he spoke as if the act demanded distance. For a single breath the clearing held. Even the torches seemed to hush. Then the half-draped body moved, an involuntary flick of a hand, a shallow intake. A villager gasped. The priest let the phrase fall like a bell. Some listeners shuffled sideways. The investigator watched the villagers' faces and saw an immediate consequence. The priest staggered, one acolyte began to cry out, a child began to wail, and a few people sat against a stone as if a blow had landed. Whether the phrase "did the promised consolation" or enforced obedience mattered less now than the rupture it had caused. The villagers' belief in the rite's benefit collided with the ledger's reveal and mirror's testimony. The community's solidarity sagged. Elder Oren lowered the charter and said in a voice that carried defeat, "We made it for water and mill. I thought we had no choice." The investigator made a choice in that moment, concrete and hard. He forced the priest's hand open and took the small bone charm and the remaining scraps. He would open the reliquary at the grave as a public action, both to prove what had been done and to strip the priest's authority of secrecy. The priest shoved him, and the investigator fell against cold stone. A rapid shove and counter followed, 3 quick lines of argument in which each named the other's betrayal. Then Havel intervened physically and held the two apart. The climax arrived when the investigator unwrapped the last paper completely and read a single sentence that the steward had penned. Counsel granted in exchange for fealty, to be invoked only by the appointed officiant, so that the village shall remain in the steward's account. The letters were small but precise. The investigator folded the paper and looked at those gathered. "This is a ledger, not a prayer," he said. "It trades freedom for provision." He put the bone charm into his palm and then did something unexpected. He crushed it between his fingers until it broke into powder. The sound was faint, but the gesture was loud. A stunned silence followed. The priest uttered a raw sound, half grievance, half anger. John lunged, but the investigation blocked him and held up the broken dust for all to see. "You may keep your charter, the investigator, you may keep the stele. But no man living will be bound at his death by a promise made in secret." He spoke slowly and used each short sentence to plant a decision into the community's hearing. Elder Oren took one long look at the ruined charm and the ledger, and then at the villagers. He had to choose whether to keep relying on the steward or to accept uncertainty and renegotiate terms openly. He did the concrete thing. He folded the charter and handed it to the investigator. "We will ask for new terms," he said, voice thin, "if the steward will not grant them. Then we will pay what we must, but we will not tie our dead to obedience." That decision caused immediate consequences. Some villagers cheered softly, others wept, and a small group of families that had benefited most from the steward's favors stepped back and vowed to leave the village if the rents rose. The priest's authority collapsed in stages. First his gatherings thinned, then his acolytes' faces went slack with uncertainty. Mira stood beside the investigator and folded her hands. John did not leave. He remained near the priest and watched with a set jaw. The investigator's final action was concrete. He pocketed a single sigil, bearing scrap he had kept from the earlier scuffle, turned to the priest and said, "You will stop these rites that bind speech and secret counsel." The priest answered with a long, ragged breath and then sank to the ground, the staff across his knees. He did not shout. He did not plead further. He only said, "I tried to keep people fed. I thought I served them." The words were admission and apology. Dawn came while the clearing argued and settled. The grave lay open and empty. Elder Oren gathered a small group to walk back toward the village to call a meeting. Havel took the shovel and began to fill the fresh earth with slow, deliberate strokes. The investigator folded the scraps, put them into his leather grimoire, and strapped it across his chest. He had won a concrete resolution. The community would no longer bind its dying with a hidden phrase traded for favors. He had also lost something, his place among them. Names had been spoken, allegiances shifted, and some neighbors would not forgive him. He walked away down the lane toward the embered sky with a single scrap in his pocket and the broken charm dust under his boot. The village behind him receded into argument and choice. The investigator did not make a speech. He did not claim moral victory. He had taken the reliquary, exposed the ledger, and forced an elder to return a charter. Those were actions. The rest would be work. At the lane's turn, a small child ran after him and handed him a coin. Malus' voice called behind him, "Do not let them take our water now, investigator." He turned, met her eyes, and nodded once. He had a concrete to-do. Visit the steward, demand new terms, or find another way to secure the village. He put the coin into his pocket and kept walking. The chapter closed on a particular beat, rather than a thought. At dawn the grave remained open for repair. Elder Oren carried the charter back toward the meeting house. The priest sat on a low stone with his head lowered. Mira walked with the investigator for 3 steps, then turned back to stand by the gravedigger, and the investigator tucked the sigil scrap into his grimoire and kept going. The immediate conflict had resolved. The right's secrecy ended that morning by a set of actions that exposed trade-offs and forced choice. The investigator left with evidence, a list of names, and an uncertain welcome. He had what he came for. The truth unwrapped in broad daylight. He also had to accept consequence. He had removed a lever that had kept the village fed under a compromised peace. That decision would ripple. But he had finished a concrete job. He had opened the reliquary, read the ledger aloud, and forced the community to decide in light of facts rather than whispers. The last image was a lane of soft light, and a man walking away with a single scrap in his hand. The village behind him beginning the long work of renegotiation and repair. Emotion roots suspicion. Emotion shifts, suspicion doubt clarity, doubt anger resolve.